When I was reading East of Eden by John Steinbeck, I was pretty vocal about it on Twitter because I was really enjoying the reading experience. And I ended up interacting with some of my Twitter friends about the book, about reading. And as part of that interaction came a recommendation by Rachel Kuhn-Mincy, one of my Twitter friends. And the recommendation was that I should consider reading the works of William Somerset Maugham. So based on the recommendation, I went out and bought these two books, The Moon Sixpence and The Magician. They were available in a nearby bookstore. And I just let these books sit for a while on my shelves. And one of the great advantages of having a small or big, in my case, small home library, is that you can let the books sit there until one day they themselves, the book, will announce to you that it is time now to read me. So that's an advantage because you don't always plan, or even when we plan, that we are reading enjoyment and are reading the desire for reading doesn't really go according to our plans. But it's really great when you have a book there on the shelf waiting and the time for it comes, and then you have the time to get into it. So I ended up reading these three books. I went out after reading The Magician. I decided to read Of Human Bondage before getting to The Moon Sixpence. So I want to talk about these three books. I read them in the chronological order, in the same order that they were originally published, beginning with The Magician. So I'll say a few things about the surface level structure of the narrative. The Magician is on the surface about two decent people, a couple engaged to be married, whose lives are interrupted very violently, very drastically by the entrance and the influence of this bad, negative villain character, the magician, Oliver Haddo. So on the surface, there's a bad guy who comes and ruins their lives. But another interpretation, which I like to think about this story in terms of a critique of the people whose lives was ruined. The magician, this quote-unquote villain character, had his influence because the characters who were influenced by him, they were already vulnerable to his influence. So what I mean by that is, I took a note here after reading the book. I wrote that the book can be read as a critique of secular humanism, so hyper-rational thinking, and how that worldview, secular humanism, hyper-rationalism, how it renders people vulnerable to certain types of charlatanism. So a con artist can do his job much better when he encounters people who are not imaginative, people who don't have a mindful relationship with their own desire. So people, because of that weakness, they become vulnerable to the trickery that the magician brings. Magician brings an unknown to their world. It brings horror, brings things that cannot be accounted for with the existing worldview of these decent, simple, unimaginative people. I think this can be described with reference to secular humanism. This book shows the incompleteness and weakness of the characters whose lives are ruined by the magician, and how their worldview produces weak and incomplete human beings. So they fail, in my reading of this book, it's not just the description of how bad this magician is, but also about how the people, the other characters, failed. They had failed to become complete human beings. And because of that failure, they become even more ruined. They become even more broken once they encounter the destructive influence of a charlatan, a magician. In this case, a charlatan and magician artists are, in this case, synonymous. After that, I read Of Human Bondage, which is a 600-page Bildungsroman tracing the development of the character at the center of the novel, Philip Carey. We see him in the beginning of the novel. He is about 8 or 9 years old, and at the end, he is in his late 20s or early 30s. He tries a lot of things, goes through lots of challenges, encounters many people, many difficulties. He goes through poverty, tries multiple different professions and fails most of them, and settles into a life towards the end. And as he settles into a lifestyle, he also settles into a philosophy. So in parallel to the development of the person, we see the development of a worldview, development of philosophy. So that is the big picture of the novel. But the big picture aspect of Human Bondage is, for me, the least important and least impressive part of this novel. Most important and most impressive are the small observations, interactions between two characters, the descriptions of loneliness, isolation, description of being in a profession and not really liking it. A group of artists who all share the same aim, all wanting to make it in art, wanting to be successful, how they influence each other. So these are what I really enjoyed. The language is very neat, clear, systematic. There is, I don't know how many times the word presently is used in this novel, but I would just say that don't make a drinking game based on the occurrences of the word presently, because that could be fatal. Philosophically, I would say this is quite close to French existentialism, especially it brought to mind my memory of reading Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. It's a little bit more resigned. It has more resignation in it, the philosophy, which is why I don't really like the philosophical aspect of the novel. But the observations are very engaging, very insightful, and I enjoyed that. Then there is The Moon and the Sixpence, and there's a lot of commonality between The Moon and Sixpence and The Magician. They both include the tension between the will towards individuality, the will to break convention, the force that wants to assert itself, the will to live differently, and the force of convention. That tension is present in both of these novels. The love triangle, different kinds of love triangle, but in similar pattern, show up in both novels. And this is about the life of an artist. Somebody on YouTube said that for people who are pursuing art, this is a must read. And I was quite puzzled by that statement. For me, the most surprising part of this book is how much it fails to be about art from the artist's point of view. Now, in the beginning, the book is very promising. It promises to be about the interrelation between art as a response to life, art as a response to the world, the artistic style, the relationship between art and character. So what is that relationship? What is an artistic character? So it makes that promise in the beginning, but we never get to a point where we have enough sympathy towards the artist, the character, central character in this novel, Charles Strickland. We never have enough sympathy towards that character to be able to see and feel his world. The point of view always remains external. The point of view never really stops being a part of the convention, never ceases to be on the side of the convention. At the end, in the beginning, the narrator says, I should confess, I never realized in the beginning when I first encountered Charles Strickland, I didn't know why he was a great man, why he was a genius. But I was surprised. By the end, he still doesn't get it. He still doesn't understand. At the end, he says he's a great genius because it is now established opinion. It's after his death. Now a lot of important art critics hold him to very high esteem. And according to that the new established opinion, he's a great artist. But that's not really an argument. That's not really a demonstration of genius. Another side of this, another part that is interesting for me in this book is the relationship between context and the passionate character that this book is about. In the beginning, that we see the character in an relatively unfriendly context in London, with his family, and against that background, his decision to be free looks like a really violent gesture. But in the second half of the novel, when we see him in a new context, in Tahiti, where the context is more sympathetic to his passionate lifestyle, to his live to individuality, to freedom, we see that the tension between convention, the context, and individual doesn't always have to be so strong, so dramatic, that there can be relatively more and less friendly contexts. So, I think that's good enough as a brief description. Might incite your interest into reading these books or other works by Somerset Maugham. I think the next book that I read, I don't know when that will be, but the next book will be his collection of 10 novels and novelists, I think. His essays on literary criticism. And if I do that, I will share my thoughts with you as well. All right, thank you very much for your attention, and I will speak with you next time.